Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Interim Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Robert Segal. Robert Segal is the 6th century chair in religious studies at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. On November 18, 2013, he gave a lecture titled, "Does the Worship of Gaia Bring Myth Back to the World?" as a guest of the UO Folklore program. Thanks, Robert, for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
The title of your talk implies that myth has been lost to the modern world. Is that what you think?
No, I think that, do you mind if I don't say hello to my mother-in-law? I don't like her. Okay, so I think that, no. I make this distinction, which we're going to make in the talk, between approaches to myth from what I call, this sounds more academic than it's meant to be, between what I call the 19th century, between approaches to myth in the 19th century and approaches to myth in the 20th century. And what I say, put succinctly, is that myth in the 19th century, which is a long time ago. I don't think any of the persons hearing this will have been around. Were around back then, but you never know. Okay, people are living longer and longer. Anyway, myth in the 19th century was pitted against science, against natural science, and myth was assumed to do what natural science does, which is explain the origin or the operation, or both the origin and operation of events in the physical world, such as why it rains, such as why the sun rises and sets. And the view of the 19th century was that myth and science not just duplicated each other in what they did, but were mutually exclusive. You could not, they were not like, as I say when I teach, they were not like cars and horses, as if when you introduce cars, horses could no longer be used. No, it was as if when cars were invented, horses were no longer possible, and not just because they could conceivably, run into each other on the road. Rather, the explanation that science gave was, or the explanation that myth gave, was every bit as direct as the explanation that science gave. That is, so you couldn't put God as the underlying cause, the cause of events, who set up scientific laws and then let them run their pace, run their course. Rather, the mythic explanation was that God operated directly in the world in place of scientific laws. So why did it rain? Because a rain god, for example, collected buckets of water in heaven and decided, for whatever reason, to dump those buckets on a designated place below. When Zeus, as a god of thunder and lightning, decided to send thunder and lightning, Zeus did it by, let's say, going to his collection of thunderbolts and physically removing one, thrusting his hand back, and directing it in where he wanted to go. So that took the place, at least for the most part, of a scientific explanation, which was and is impersonal, mechanical. Why does it rain? Why does it thunder? Why is there lightning? For meteorological reasons. Mm-hmm. Now, by contrast, the 20th century view has been that whatever myth is, or was, if we put it in the past tense, was that whatever myth is, it's not a rival to science. Either the subject matter of myth is other than the physical world, and what can that be? It can be human beings, it can be society, it can be human beings or society, it can be the mind. Whatever it is, it's not the physical world itself. So there's no clash. Alternatively, there's no clash because what myth does is not explain or control the physical world, but reconcile people to it, for example. Therefore, the 20th century view, in my take on this, was that myth and science were compatible. You could have the two because they didn't collide, because they were either about something else, about different things, or did different things. I take up the case of Gaia, like some other cases, because I ask the question whether the myth of Gaia, whether Gaia, which is the ancient Greek name for the earth, whether what's called the myth of Gaia can bring myth back to the physical world, but compatibly with science. And if it can do that, then it's doing something that the 19th century and the 20th century thought couldn't be done, which is putting myth, which is linking myth to science, but doing it compatibly with science. And I take up the case of Gaia and ask publicly whether it works.
So let me just back you up
Yeah,
a tiny
yeah,
bit.
yeah.
So in the 20th century, you argue that there's a reconciliation. So 19th century science says myth is a fantasy, we've trumped it, it's no longer relevant. 20th century comes along, and there are thinkers that suddenly make it possible to reconcile science and myth. I know that you've written about Malinowski and you've written about Jung and Freud. So just because doubtless our viewers are aware of Jung and Freud, say a little bit about how they worked specifically to reconcile myth and science.
All right, look, Freud and Jung, as different as they are from each other, reconcile myth with science by, in terms of both the subject matter of myth and let's call it the function of myth. Myth for them, Freud and Jung alike, apart from the differences between them, myth and Jung alike, Freud and Jung alike, that was a mythic slip. Freud and Jung alike say that the subject matter of myth could not be farther removed from the physical world than they take it to be. It's not only not about the external world, it's not about anything physical. It's about human beings, and it's not about human beings' bodies, it's about human beings' minds. And it's not about human beings' conscious minds, it's about their unconscious minds. And the first step for Freud and Jung in understanding myth psychologically, is to remove it from any connection to the physical world. In the standard term of both Freud and Jung, myth is a projection onto the physical world of something that is not in the physical world but is in people's minds. And what is the function of myth? What does myth do? It doesn't explain anything. It puts people in touch, albeit unconsciously, with their own unconscious. So they have an almost solipsistic view of, I have a dictionary for anyone who needs that. Okay, they have an almost solipsistic view of what myth is. For technically, Jung's view is more solipsistic than Freud's, but that's beside the point. So for them, they're to me the extreme examples of a 20th century view, because you can accept myth and still be scientific, okay? And one catches, and this is also typical of the 20th century, is, although it's not uniform in the 20th century, the reason they're able to do that is that they read myth non-literally. They read it symbolically. By contrast, 19th century theorists, for example, James Frazer of Golden Bough fame, read myth literally.
Right, okay. So, Gaia. So you've told us who Gaia is, and you told us that Gaia is the sort of test case that you want to talk about. Why is Gaia at issue today? What's brought Gaia back to? Why are we even talking about Gaia right now?
In 2 more minutes, your listeners will be asking the same question.
I don't think so.
You don't think? Okay. We can poll them anyway, if there's still one more line. There has. The worship of Gaia, and that's actually what it's called, is an aspect of paganism, which has been revived. And in fact, until recently, paganism was a pejorative term. Paganism was what those idiots that the Israelites opposed in the Bible did. All right, so it was considered a pejorative term. It no longer is, at least in many circles. So. And this is what it's called. The worship of Gaia, is Gaia, has been revived. I mean, in limited numbers. I don't think Gaia is threatening the number of worshipers of Allah. But there is Gaia worship. Now. But there's paganism. There's contemporary paganism of all kinds. What interests me about Gaia is that Gaia is the worship of the earth, and the point is, to call it the worship of the earth is, for me, by definition, to turn Gaia into a god. Anything worshipped, as I use the term worshipped, is a god. But that's not what really grabs me about Gaia. What grabs me about Gaia is the work that legendary English scientist, American scientist, James Lovelock, who got the name from, look, the name goes back to the ancient Greek creation story called the Theogony by Hesiod, Hesiod. And in Hesiod's Theogony, Gaia is one of 4 members of the first generation of gods. And from Gaia, by reproduction, come most of, not all, of subsequent ancient Greek gods. Okay, so Gaia is in Hesiod the personification of the earth and an actual god. Lovelock takes the name, and as he says, he got the name from someone. The person who suggested the name to him is the famous author of Lord of the Flies. So suggested the name to him to characterize what scientifically Lovelock was finding about, discovering about the earth. Now, there were scientists prior to him who pioneered the notion that scientifically, that's the point, scientifically, Gaia could be characterized as a god. Now,
Can I just interrupt you for a
please, don't hesitate. Yeah.
So, Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis is what in a nutshell?
Now here's the catch, and this is what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon. When he wrote he's written a number of volumes. When he wrote the first one, called Gaia, he said unhesitatingly that Gaia was seemingly unavoidably conscious entity. The earth itself adjusted itself, regulated itself to fend off, look, I'm no scientist, okay, and obviously neither is Lovelock. I'm just kidding. To fend off threats to it. A self-regulating mechanism, but not in his first book, Gaia, 1979, not a mechanically self-regulating, but I don't see how else you can read him, but a willfully, intentionally, purposefully self-regulating mechanism. Now, therefore, he's ascribing to Gaia a consciousness. He's ascribing to Gaia intent. And he's ascribing intent not to individual species or genuses, of living things. No, to the earth as a whole, to the earth itself. Now, so here, what I find, this is what grabs me, okay? This and Internal Revenue Service. What grabs me is that here you get somebody who's he's not religious as far as I know, okay? And here he is taking an ancient Greek myth, happily taking an ancient Greek myth and saying, not that the myth itself is true, but that the characterization of the myth as a personality, which is to say, a conscious, willful, deliberative entity, it holds on scientific grounds. Hesiod didn't care about Gaia as meeting criteria of science, okay? But Lovelock does. So what Lovelock is saying is, what I call the myth of Gaia, actually he uses the term myth itself, but what I at least call the myth of Gaia holds scientifically. So what he's doing is accomplishing a feat that I argue, is not done, was not even attempted, either in the 19th century or in the 20th century, which was to place myth in the physical world rather than remove it from it, but do so on scrupulously scientific grounds on the other hand. He's arguing as a scientist. Well, since he wrote the book, he's qualified his claims. And as things stand now, I mean, he really seems to have not quite abandoned, but almost abandoned Gaia as what I would call a god. So now Gaia seems to be, alas, to me, lamentably, Gaia seems to be reduced to, that's what I would say, his hypothesis. He used to call it the Gaia hypothesis, now he calls it the Gaia theory, as if it's been established, so it has more weight, more clout, more permanence than the Gaia hypothesis would. Now Gaia is reduced to certain mechanisms of the earth itself, and he explicitly denies that in invoking the term Gaia, he in any way meant to personify it. All I can say is, when he came out, when he made the splash that he did, back in 1979, it wasn't for the reduced, whittled down characterization of Gaia that he now has. It was rather Gaia as unavoidably, even if he never used the term God, Gaia as unavoidably the equivalent of a god. And so I ask whether Gaia taken as God, and therefore the story of Gaia taken as myth, can still hold. Because if it does, then we have a case in which myth has been brought back to the physical world.
So, in everything you've said, you haven't given me a clear sense of where you come out on that. So, do you think?
No, I don't think. I think that that Lovelock tries to have it both ways and doesn't, and he has I wouldn't call it a Hopkins choice, because it's not as if either choice is bad, but he has to make a choice, and the choice he makes is to reject what brought him fame. Nobody cared about. No one would have cared about. I mean, he was a scientist who accomplished some things, but I don't think his worldwide popularity stemmed from his work as a scientist. It was rather the qualification that he brought from science to proclaiming the myth of Gaia. I think that he can't have it both ways, because even when at the beginning, when he was most committed, he still tried to get away with calling the myth of Gaia, which I think he used occasionally, myth, a metaphor. But so I think he wants to have it both ways, and he can, and he gives up really on the, for me at least, by far the more provocative side.
Okay, so I want to talk now about about Segal, less about him. So you've written, there's more to myth than falsity, even when myth is false.
Yes.
What do you mean?
Oh, I think it's, okay. I think that, look, I'm not like Joseph Campbell, on whom I've written galore. Joseph Campbell was an evangelist for myth. I mean, myth for him was a panacea. I mean, it really was. So I've written on Campbell, but Jung and Mircea Eliade come close in evangelizing for myth. I'm not like that, but I think that myth is undersold when it's used, as it is popularly, as a dismissive, as a dismissive term for a false claim. So look, titles like JFK, the man in the myth, right? Okay, so when myth is used that way, myth pitted against reality, myth pitted against truth, then I say that is, I mean, I'm in no position to dictate the usage. I think, though, that misses the point of myth, which is this: myth can be false, myth can equally be true, and that neither state of myth, to me, catches what really counts, which is the hold, the pull that myth has. Look, I mean, if one tries to refute a myth, which is why books like JFK, the Man in the Myth, and there actually is a title like that, okay, it's probably more than one, is so popular, is that people don't want to give up on, they want to give up on the myth. And they cannot want to give up on the myth, even when they know or suspect that myth is perhaps, an exaggeration. In the UK, the myth of Princess Diana as saintly, all right? Now, her fans, for the most part, knew that Diana was not quite so selfless, helping the sick and the ailing, visiting AIDS victims. That there was probably another side, not another side. There were other aspects to Diana that weren't so saintly, but they still celebrated it. My view is people celebrate the myth independent of the actual truth or falsity. It doesn't matter. It's the grip that myth holds. But because they celebrate it, they celebrate the figures of who were called mythic. It's hard to dislodge. By the same token, to call something mythic, for me, to call a figure mythic, an event mythic, should not be taken as automatically rejecting the truth of it. Rather, the way it should be taken is to say, look, myth is about, to call something a myth is to refer to the power, that was one of Campbell's terms, the grip, the hold that it has, whether or not what grabs people is actually true or false. It misses the point. If I say, look, it's a myth that I have $5 in my pocket. Now, no one would ordinarily, or I can imagine a situation in which that would qualify as a myth. But ordinarily, if I say I have $5 in my pocket, and it turns out that I don't, one wouldn't call that a myth. One would call that a false belief. All right, a false belief.
Or a lie.
Or, well, depends on the case of Judaism. We consider it a compliment. Anyway, it depends on. It would be considered something false. You know, that's it. Merely false. So all you have to do is check and find out, either you or someone else, that you don't have $5 in your pocket. Big deal. That's the end of it. But to call it a myth, if you could even call that a myth, and it would be hard, it would mean something like your conviction or someone else's conviction about you, that no matter what state you were in, what situation you were in, what locale you were in, you always had $5 in your pocket. I'm not even sure that would qualify it as myth, but it's something that elevates the literal claim to something grand, something grandiose. And I'm saying what one says about a figure, or an event, to call it mythic, is not less mythic if it's false than if it's true. And more to the point, is not less mythic if it's true.
What then for you, what you described the grip, the hold that it has. So tell me why you're not just a kind of latter-day psychologist of that you've psychologized myth. That is to say,
I get you.
You know, it has this power. So Superman.
Yeah, I think
right?
Yeah. Now, the catch with Superman or Sherlock Holmes is that, well, certainly more in the case of Superman than than of Sherlock Holmes. I mean, how many persons believe it literally? So the point is, if you say no, it's just a myth, what are you trying to get people to concede? That the Superman they thought they saw wasn't.
So part of your definition is that the people who hold this belief, they hold it to be true, regardless of whether it is true or not.
Yeah, I would say, and I'm embarrassed to use the term power because that was Campbell's term. But I would say the grip, the hold that myth has stems from. Presupposes that it is being held as literally true, and that can be by an individual, more likely by a community. I mean, most people don't invent their own myths. I mean, myths tend to be group wide. I mean, the group can be a locale, the group can be the cosmos. But to call something, to me, yes, a myth is something that is at least believed literally. It may also have symbolic ramifications of all kinds, but it's at least believed literally. And my view is that the clout that it has stems from accepting it as true, whether or not it turns out to be. And look, the test would be, if it turns out to be false, do people give it up? For the most part, they do. But the grip that it has comes even while they recognize it may not be true. Take the case of Jesus, okay, as we all should. There are people who believe in Jesus as a symbol. Now, as a symbol, for example, the perfect human being. I mean, some around here, the perfect Oregonian. I don't know. Okay, what the hell? Because they're now gospels that say he exorcised. Anyway, not exorcised. That's something else. He did that too. They're not mutually exclusive. Okay, but I mean, one can believe in Jesus and not believe that Jesus performed miracles. One can believe in Jesus and not believe that Jesus was the Son of God. So I would say there's an array of positions that one can take, but I wouldn't be claiming that most persons, at least, would still believe in Jesus if somehow, I don't know, archaeology somehow was able to disprove the existence of Jesus. But that the power that Jesus has lies in more than his actual supposed deeds.
I see. So we've got about 2 minutes left, and the question that comes to my mind is, you're a professor of religion.
Yeah.
And would I be wrong in saying your approach to religion is to take a kind of psychological approach. So how would you characterize?
I would call it social scientific.
Social
so broader than, so what I'm interested in is the array of approaches to myth or theories of myth that have arisen in the last 150 years. Not just psychology, also anthropology, sociology, political science, literature, religious studies and philosophy. Now, those are not social sciences, the last three, but they certainly have come up with theories of their own. But the main theories that have arisen in the last 150 years come from the social sciences. Probably in order of the number of theories: anthropology, then sociology, anthropology, then psychology, then sociology, then running much farther back, political science and economics. Those are what I think really keep the study of myth going, but not to the exclusion of literature, religious studies, and philosophy. But those have been around for a long time. I mean, the thing that these other fields, that these social sciences have going for them, is usually comparative study.
So do you've mentioned Judaism in passing, Christianity. Are those for you mythic systems, or are they something different?
No, what I wouldn't do, and this is one of the accomplishments of the 20th century, I wouldn't restrict myth to religious myth, which is what the 19th century did. You know, why do things happen? God decided, okay, whatever religion it was. 20th century, there can be non-religious as well as religious myths. Nationalism, all right? Celebrities, okay? Celebrities, myths of celebrities. I've written about Hollywood stars, so as mythic figures. So I think in the 20th century and continuing into the 21st century, all right, the array of figures and domains from which myths come is much wider than it was in the 19th century. So look, I'm not the one to say that myth will always be here. That's the kind of thing that Campbell would say, but it's certainly still around.
Very interesting. Well, I think we're just about out of time, so let me thank you, Robert, for speaking with us today. I've been speaking with Robert Segal, the 6th Century Chair in Religious Studies at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. On November 18th, 2013, he gave a lecture at the U of O titled, "Does the Worship of Gaia Bring Myth Back to the World?" as a guest of the UO Folklore program. Thanks very much for watching. Thanks again, Robert, for joining us.
Thank you.